excited to hear about a cemetery? You know, you'd be surprised how much there is at this cemetery to learn about, to hear about. So I'm excited right now to be able to tell you a lot of the things that I have learned about the cemetery over the years, and I'm still learning. So even as of, I was telling Mike, even as of last night, I found out something new that I've included in the presentation tonight. So I became involved in tours of God's Acre for the first time in 2017 when the third grade Heritage Alliance program was created. Okay, and back then, I remember the cemetery when I was, a little kid. I'd, go up there and look at some of the stones and things like that. But I really didn't know a whole lot about the people that were buried there. And there's a lot of history there. So over the past 7 years, little by little, I've researched a lot more about the people that are buried there and the history. Some may or may not know that I love numbers and I love spreadsheets, so I do have spreadsheets going on God's Acre as well. And so I'm going to share a few numbers with you tonight. My spreadsheets are more to keep track of, some of the facts I learned. So I am going to share with you a few stories of the lives of the people, and there's going to be a few mysteries, some that I've solved, some that I haven't solved yet, but some to be solved. So we'll walk through the years of the lives of the people that lived way back when. I did want to ask, how many people have been to God's Acre in the room? Oh. Good showing. Okay. All right. How many people have relatives in God's Acre? Okay, we have a few here. All right. Okay. So this is when you first visit the cemetery. If you go down 3rd Street to South 3rd Street, you cross Main Street, you go all the way down to the very end of South 3rd Street, this is what you're going to run into if you go straight. Okay? So you have to actually turn onto Adrain to avoid, going into the cemetery. But when you first visit the cemetery, this gate is actually a replacement gate from the 20th century. The German words on the top, I will translate them for you. It says, "Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth, that they may rest from their labors, and their words do follow them." And it is a quote from Revelations 14, verse 13. The cemetery was used by the Emmaus Moravian Church for 125 years. Now you will note up there, the sign says 1742 to 1856. It was actually used a little bit longer than that. It was 1742 is when the log church was built. So the cemetery didn't start to be used until 1743 with the first burial. So that says 1742. And second of all, it was used by the church until 1868, even though there were an additional 19 graves after 1868, up until 1897. That was the last burial. Okay, so this photo was taken in 1897. There was a celebration, the 150th celebration of the founding of the Emmaus Moravian Church. And this actually shows God's Acre as it looked back then. This is a photo from the Moravian Archives. We do not possess this photo, but every time I look at it, I feel like the gravestones are just floating on the grass, and then you have an eerie little man in the middle of the photo. So it's kind of an eerie looking photo, but it's interesting to see what it looked like back in 1897. And that would have been the last year of the last burial, 1897. All right, what I did was I attempted to take a photo of those same grave rows, but in current day. So you will see the prior photo had a bunch of deciduous trees, had a very small pine tree in the middle of it. Now you will see how large the pine trees have gotten. They do tend to drop a lot of pine cones and needles and everything. They're not ideal for the cemetery, but they do provide some shade. So, but this is the way the cemetery currently looks. This was just taken a few days ago. So you can see the gravestones are not floating on the grass anymore, and the pine trees have certainly grown. So that's present day. So before we begin with more of the cemetery, I would like to share a little history and background on the beginning of the community. And I think it's important to know what was happening and what years it was happening. The people who came here and their reasons and what was happening prior to the first burial. Some of you may be familiar with with parts of this early history of Emmaus, so this may be a refresher, but hopefully you'll have a little bit more additional information. So the first settlers of Makunji, and I should say Mukundashe is the way the Indians pronounced it. Mukundashe is a Lenape word meaning feeding place of the bears. You may think it sounds a little bit like Makunji, that's where the Makunji came from, but Mukundashe was actually this whole area. It was Salisbury, it was Emmaus, it was Makunji, Lower Milford, Veracruz, Albertus, additional townships. It was a very large area that was named by the Lenape. The German immigrants were Protestant of Lutheran and Reformed faiths. Those were the ones that arrived in this area in the 1720s, and a few arrived even earlier than that. They were farmers. They were fleeing from the persecution and the war in Europe, and they were seeking religious freedom in William Penn's religious haven. There were others that were also coming to Pennsylvania for those reasons. Church services in the very beginning were being held in private houses by traveling ministers. So in 1740, the Moravians arrived in Bethlehem from Georgia. I don't know how many of you know that the Moravians actually landed in America in Savannah, Georgia in 1735. So a lot of people may not know that. They may think, oh, well, they first came to Bethlehem, but they didn't. They were sent out from Germany. They were living in Herrenhut, Germany, and they were sent out as missionaries. And so they came to Savannah, Georgia, as missionaries for the Indians down there. They were living in Savannah, Georgia, where the British were under control, but the Spanish were under control in Florida. And so it got to a point that the British were going to start fighting with the Spanish, and they asked the Moravians to bear arms. Well, at that point, after 5 years of being in Savannah, Georgia, and then being asked to not live peacefully anymore, they made a decision that they couldn't do that. They were pacifists. And so they came north to Bethlehem. So if it weren't for the British and the Spanish conflict, the Moravians may have stayed in Savannah, Georgia, and may have come to Bethlehem even later. But they did come to Bethlehem. And then in the 1740s, the small community here in Mukundashe began to search for someone permanent to lead them in worship. So those are the years, the early years of this area. Okay, once the Moravians arrived in Bethlehem, 10 of the villagers here decided to go visit the community of Bethlehem. And they were in search of a permanent minister. They were tired of having traveling ministers. Sometimes they would have a minister, sometimes they wouldn't. And in 1741, Jacob Ehrenhardt invited some of the Moravians to his home here in Emmaus, not called Emmaus back then. David Nitschmann, who was a prominent Moravian missionary and a first bishop, came and he held a Singstunde. Everybody know what a Singstunde is? Okay. All right, some of us do. A Singstunde is a service that is all sung. It's all songs. It's all hymns. Okay? It's not preaching, it's not talking, it's just singing. The Moravian missionary and patron Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf also came to Pennsylvania in the fall of 1741, and that's the statue that you see there, and also held a service at the Ehrenhart House on December 2nd, 1741. So basically we have 10 villagers who went to Bethlehem. They started worshiping over there, and then they started inviting the Moravians to come over here. So December of 1741, the settlers of Mukundashay sent a petition to the church in Bethlehem to take the community of Mukundashay under their spiritual supervision with one condition: that everything be instituted according to Lutheran practices. So here we have settlers here who are both Lutheran and Reformed Lutheran, or modern day UCC. And they're saying to the Moravians, we would like you to lead us spiritually, but only according to Lutheran practices. Well, that stipulation was accepted, actually. But what it meant was that the community was not obligated to live by the choir system that was set up in Bethlehem, but would have Moravian ministers. So the choir system was a very interesting system that they, I should say that Anna Nitschmann created in 1730. She was the daughter of a bishop, and she was also a deaconess of the Moravian Church. And what the choir system did was it separated people by age and by gender, okay? So that if they were living in the choir system, it was a community living situation, they would be separated in housing. So the families in Bethlehem weren't necessarily living together. There was the widow's home, there was the single sisters or the single women's home, there was a single men's home. They were sort of separated. And the villagers of Mukundashay did not want to live like that. They wanted to live in family units. So the Moravians in Bethlehem agreed to that, but then they also agreed that they would have a minister here. So before we continue, I just want to give you just a few dates so you understand the history here. 1742, 100 acres of land are donated to the community by Jacob Ehrenhart and Sebastian Knaus. And this land was used not only for the village, but it was also used for a log church and a cemetery. The log church was erected in 1742. 1743 and 1745 are the first two burials on God's Acre. And 1746, the village built a boarding school for the community. Now the boarding school was built in the area of where the current Moravian church is. The log church that was erected at God's Acre. So we'll show you in a minute the location of the church. And then in 1747, the Moravian congregation of 44 people was formed, and it was named Salisbury, or this was the area of Salisbury. Then in 1758 and 1759, you might have heard that it was a closed community. Didn't start out as a closed community because they were Lutheran and Reformed Protestants, became a Moravian congregation, and 1758 to 759 is when they closed the Moravian village so that only Moravians could live here, and they had to abide by the Moravian laws. So that was the Gemeinort, the closed village. And then 1761 is when the village finally got its name of Emmaus. So it went from Mukundashay to Salisbury to Emmaus. All right, so we talked about the choir system. The cemetery is set up by the choir system. And you can see how the choir system worked. So row 1 was all boys. Rows 2 and 3 were men's rows. Rows 4 and 5 were women's rows. Rows 6 and 7 were girls' rows. Rows 8 and 9 were women's rows. Row 10 was men's row. Row 11 and row 12 were boys' rows. So I always explain to the third graders, they were not buried with their family. Husbands and wives were not buried together. Children were not buried with their parents. Okay. So you'll also see that the first burials, and that says 3, it's actually the first 5 burials, were completed. And I'll explain that. I always thought it was the first 3, but I learned something new last night. So it is the first 5 burials were not done according to the choir system. In other words, the first 3 burials were buried in row 2. Well, they were all children, and row 2 is currently a men's row. So they were not buried according to that. And then there were a couple other, which I'll get into a little bit later. The other thing is, you will see the stones are all flat. They're simple, and that is to reflect the values of the Moravians. So the Moravians believed in equality, they believed in modesty, and they believed in simplicity. So as we look at some of the earlier stones, you will see how small they are and how simple they are. Okay, this is a picture of the God's Acre directory. And it has all of the names listed by row and area of burial. There are 366 people listed as buried at God's Acre on the directory board, but 350 is the highest grave number. So how does that work? Well, it turns out there are sub-grave letters for a few of the burials. And I'll talk about a few of them as we go along. But for example, we are going to talk about grave number 311 and 311A. And they were buried close in time, not necessarily close together. So the other thing is that there are a few graves that contain more than one child. So there are actually 2 graves that contain 2 sisters, so that's 4 children in 2 graves. And there's another grave that contains 3 sisters. That's 3 children in 1 grave. So, and we'll talk about those in a little bit too. So here are some of the common family names. I always like to show, the number of people buried at God's Acre with one family name. So for example, Canals has 34 members of the family buried there. And we'll get into a little bit of those numbers later on. Romig has 14, but there are another 7 or 8 that are actually buried on the Romig farm. And that was listed in the Register of Burials. So there were Romigs that were not buried at God's Acre. And Chris, 19 there, and Gearing. So a lot of familiar names as far as the numbers at God's Acre. Here's some grave numbers. We talked about 366 people buried there. The number of stones, based on the inventory that was taken in 1939 by the Emmaus Moravian Church, there's 284 stones. Why is there such a big difference? The big difference is there were many people buried without stones, okay? And there were many of those burials were children, okay? So quite a few children are buried without a stone. There are also a number of missing stones since 1939. So in 2022 and 2023, we had a restoration completed of God's Acre. And what the restoration encompassed was lifting of the stones and cleaning of the stones. And I walked the cemetery so many times, including with my husband many times, counting stones and trying to figure out what's missing, what isn't, how many stones do we have. Currently, we now have 278. There was actually a seventh missing stone that was found during the restoration. So the number without stones are 88. It's not known yet what has happened to the other 6 missing stones. There may be no answers, but we don't know exactly. There may be something else we can still do to try to locate them. We do know where they were originally located, so that's the good news. All right, so these are the first 3 graves. Row 2, which is a men's row. The first grave, it says number 1. It's a little different 1, but you can see the way it is 1. And it says G. Mose. Well, G. Mose was George Mose, but his first name was John. They called him by his middle name, George. And he died in 1743. Now, the 3rd graders say, no, that's a 5. Well, it's actually a 3, but it's a little crooked, or whatever you want to say. But he definitely died in 1743. The second grave is E. Mose, Mosin, as the 3rd graders point out to me. You might miss it, but after the E, there's an M there, an O, a Z, an I, and an N. Okay? So Mosin. But that was actually George's sister, Elizabeth. So why did she have a different last name, Mosin versus Mose? Well, in Germany, they used IN to change the last name for all females. So Mose would be a male, and Mosin would be a female version, okay? I wasn't familiar with any of that until, and I didn't really realize the Germans did that, but we took a trip to Slovakia in 2008, and I always thought, oh, well, there's different names here. It's Harakal and Harakalova. And I couldn't figure out, well, who was the Harakalova? Well, Harakalova was just the female of Harakal, okay? So a woman whose last name was Harakal was Harakalova, and a man last name was Harakal. So same thing with the Germans, Mose, Mosin. All right, then we have the third grave, and you'll see how simple that one is. It has number 3, and then it has MW. So a lot of the graves didn't even have the full name, they were just initials. This was for Maria Wetzel. Now, all 3 of these graves were children, and fairly young children. The next 2 graves were also not buried according to the choir system. I have their first burials according to the choir system, but this all changed last night when I discovered that they were actually boys buried in a men's row. So these graves are Martin Knaus and John Knaus. They are not Sebastian Knaus's children. They are the sons of John Henry Knaus and Maria Catherine Rader Knaus. Martin Knaus was only 23 months when he passed away, and John Knaus was 9 years old. They died within a day of each other. So imagine losing 2 children within a day of each other. That was the kind of lives they led. Unfortunately, they lost a lot of children. These are examples of stones that really didn't hold up very well. The material is sandstone, and you really can't see any of the engraving. We know who they are based on the inventory that was taken in 1939. Because that inventory basically goes by the rows, it goes by the number in the row, so we can actually go down each row and determine who that is, even though you can't read the stone anymore. So the Moravians were big proponents of education for both boys and girls. And the first school was built in 1746. We mentioned that a little earlier. And it was a boarding school. So it allowed area children to come and reside in the school. The school was open to Moravians and non-Moravians. It was open to the outside community. The Moravians believed in education for all. Children would come from distant communities. There were even 2 Native American girls studying at the school. And they are buried, there are 2 of them buried at God's Acre. So the first grave, buried according to the choir system, was the Native American named Hannah. We don't have a last name, she was just Hannah. And she was stone number 6. She was burial number 6. And the first one that was buried according to the choir system, so she was in a girl's row. But her stone has gone missing. So we do not have Hannah's stone anymore. There are possibilities that, we're not quite sure what happened to it. We do know what happened to one of the stones that we found. So it would be nice if that happened to Hannah's stone too, but right now we're not quite sure. And maybe we'll find out what happened to it, maybe we won't. The second stone, the next Native American, number 7, grave number 7, was Rebecca. She was also buried in a girl's row, also buried according to the choir system. So Hannah died in April of 1748, and then Rebecca died in May of 1749. Daniel Graff is the next stone, number 8, and he died in June of 1749. And there was one other child who was named Heinrich Oberle, who was also a student at the school. He died in April of 1749. Now, it's believed that these 3 children may have been victims of either smallpox or scarlet fever, which frequently affected children at the time, and all 3 of them were at the school. All right, so we get to grave number 11. Okay, so what I'd like to point out is the first grave is 1743, and there are 10 more until 1750. They were all children. So the first deaths in the first 7 years of the cemetery were all children, 10 children. We then have the first adult being buried in 1750. Sven Rosine was actually a visitor to the community. He was visiting with Bishop Kammerhoff from Germany. He was actually a Swede who studied in Sweden as well as Germany, and his wife was from Germany. He joined the Moravians while he was still in Europe, and he was visiting with Bishop Kammerhoff, and they came to assist Bishop Spangenberg. So in December 1st of 1750, he stopped in Salisbury to visit with the Moravians on his way to Maryland, and he became ill that day, and he died the next day. So that's why he's buried at God's Acre, because he died here in Emmaus. Then we have grave number 12, and she is the first settler that died, the first adult settler that died. So we have 2 adults that died fairly close together. She died, her name was Catherine Tauber Rader, and they called her Old Mother Rader. She was born in 1671, earlier than any other person in the settlement. So she was the oldest person in the settlement. And she died April of 1751 at the age of 80. Back then, that was quite old. Her stone shows the simplicity of the earlier graves. This is once again sandstone, You can see very clearly the number 12. What isn't quite as clear is the initials, and it was just two initials. It was a C, and then the second initial would be an R. So the sandstone stones really don't hold up very well after 281 years. So these are more examples of the simplicity of the early stones. We have grave number 13. You can see hers was a little bit harder material than sandstone, so the engraving did hold up pretty well, but it was just her initials, A.M.B., and she was a widow. Her name was Anna Maria Bless. And then number 15 is Christina Guth, but it was just C.G., so you can see the number 15 and C.G. Now, the grave stone of 15 is an example of some of the stones where they had a little bit of like a slate topping to the sandstone. So you'll see a few more of those as we go through the stones. Here are examples of different materials and shapes. So the first stone is a little bit of sandstone, a little bit harder than sandstone now, because you can still see all of the engraving. Second stone is done in tiger marble, a little bit more expensive than regular marble, having the black go through that. The next stone is an example of a little bit fancier stone. It's still small, but has a rounded top. And the last stone is also an example of a fancier stone. These were more expensive because of the way they were cut, and it's also made of tiger marble. So just so you know, these stones are all stones, and I didn't do this on purpose. I just went through the cemetery looking for some different examples, but they're all children. So Magdalena, the first one, was Magdalena Christ. She died of dysentery at 3 months old in 1795. The next one, Susanna Liebert. She was the daughter of George Liebert, who was one of our Revolutionary War veterans, died at 10 weeks. The next one, which is also in German, if you can see some of that engraving, it's all German. She was only a few months over 2 years old when she died, Wilhelmina Joost. And the last one, which is a unique shape, is the stone of Henrietta Christ, and she was an infant who died of quinsy. Quinsy, in other words, is some sort of throat abscess. So I don't know if it was like an infection of the tonsils or whatever, but it is in the throat.
Never heard.
Right, I didn't either. Okay, next. We have two examples of slate-topped stones. They're written in German with the married female last names. So the first one, number 35, is Eva Eisenharten. So you will see her last name is split between the first line and the second line. So after Eva, it's E-I, a German S, E-N, and then it's H-A-R-T-I-N, which meant she was married to Eisenharten. Okay. And then the next one was Benigna. Yeah, Romig Inn. Okay, so just a little background. Eva was born in Tittelsheim, Wetterau, which is where Sebastian Knaus was born in 1719. She was Reformed. She came to Pennsylvania with her parents in 1723. This is an interesting story. She married at age 19, was married for 12 years, and had 4 children. She then married again and had another 4 children. She came to the settlement in January of 1760 and married Andreas Eisenhart, so this is where she gets the Eisenharten, who was a widower, in August of 1760, and they had a daughter. She was survived by all 9 of her children. Now, you start thinking, why did she get married so often? Well, let me tell you, people weren't divorcing, they weren't leaving, they were losing their husbands to death. So these were widows who were just trying to take care of their family. Okay, so what I came across pretty often is that someone would lose their husband, and 2 years later they'd find a new husband, and they would continue. It was a way of taking care of families. And of course, women at that time weren't allowed to own their own property, so they had, problems if they had a lot of children. Benigna Romick was born in 1743, and she was the daughter of Conrad and Katharina Wetzel. She is my 6th great-grand-aunt. She married John Christian Romick in December of 1763, but she died of childbirth in April of 1766 at the age of 22.
Wow.
Okay, there are 8 of the 10 original settlers that joined the Bethlehem Church before Emmaus, the Emmaus Moravian community was founded, buried at God's Acre. So 8 of the 10. There are also 8 of the original 44, the additional 44 charter members buried on God's Acre. So there are 16 of the original charter members buried at God's Acre. The ones with the stars are the ones that, or the asterisks, are the ones that actually joined the church in Bethlehem prior to the Emmaus Church being founded. So these are the gravestones of Jacob Ehrenhardt and Sebastian Knaus, who are called the fathers of Emmaus. Fathers because they gave the land for the founding of the community and the village. But these are not original stones. Both of the original stones were replaced. And they were replaced by the family. Okay? We don't see a lot of this at God's Acre. Most of the stones have not been replaced, but these are 2 examples of replacement stones. The one, Jacob Ehrenhardt, was replaced in 1853, and Sebastian Knaus's stone was replaced at a family reunion in 1904. Jacob Ehrenhardt was born in Marstadt, Germany in 1716, and he was Lutheran and was a blacksmith by trade. He also tilled the soil. In other words, he was also a farmer. He came to Pennsylvania in 1739, and by January of 1742, he had a land grant of 126 acres. He died at a very young age, at 44, in February of 1760. And Jacob and his wife had 8 children and 26 grandchildren. Sebastian Knaus was born in the village of Tittelsheim in Wetteravia, Germany, in 1714. He was reared in the Reformed faith, and he came to Pennsylvania in 1723 with his parents. He served an apprenticeship as a cartwright in the home of the Reformed elder Henry Antis. Does everybody know what a cartwright is?
A wheel?
What's that? Okay, so it's a cartwright, it's a wainwright, or it is a wagoner. All of those terms were used. They were wagon makers. A cartwright is a wagon maker, so is a wainwright. Okay, he settled in Mukundashay, where he later farmed, had a grant of 200 acres, and he died in 1777 at the age of 62. Sebastian and his wife had 14 children, 91 grandchildren, and 36 great-grandchildren. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is a married couple. I had to put them together because they're my 6 great-grandparents, 6 times great-grandparents. So these are the parents of Maria Wetzel, who was the 3rd child buried in the very beginning. She's grave number 3. Conrad Wetzel was born in Pfalz, which is in the Bayern, and he was reared a Lutheran. He came with his parents arriving in the port of Philadelphia in 1720, so pretty early on. His wife was born in the Rhineland in Germany and also came to America with her parents, landing in Philadelphia in 1718. Conrad and Catherine married in 1725 in Macungie, and they lived on a farm outside of the village. They had 10 children in 24 years. Conrad died in 1753 at the age of 55, and he is grave number 14. And Anna died December 10th, 1767 at the age of 58, and she's grave number 44. Only one of their children of the 10 children, is buried at God's Acre. So you can see these are two stones. Conrad's is a little bit of sandstone, but it's a little whiter than that, so it had maybe some sort of mixture. And then Katharina, you can see on hers, it says Katharina Wetzelin, so you can see the IN. Hers is her script is in German. I believe his might be too, but it's hard to tell. So that's grave number 14 and grave number 44. All right, more founding members. These are also members. With the last slide, Conrad was one of the 10 that went over to Bethlehem to join the church. His wife did not. She became a member of the congregation here in Emmaus. These 4 were original members of the 10 in Bethlehem. So we have Anna Katharina Transu Knaus, who was the wife of Sebastian Knaus, in grave 120. Samuel Eberhard Kopp was in grave number 23. You can see Anna's grave. Knaus is spelled with 1 S. You can also see that it is all in English, whereas Samuel Eberhard Kopp is all in German. And then we also have Anna Katharina Harlacher Kopp, who was Samuel's wife. She is number 20. Hers is also in German. And then we have Maria Barbara Andres Ehrenhardt, who is Jacob's wife, in grave number 71, which isn't a very clear engraving. So Anna Knaus was born in 1722 in the Palatinate and brought up in the Reformed faith. And she came to Pennsylvania with her parents in 1730. Settling here. She married Sebastian Knaus in 1741, and she died in 1799 at the age of 77, survived by 12 of her 14 children. She also had 91 grandchildren and 36 great-grandchildren, of which 73 grandchildren and 32 great-grandchildren were living when she died. So I did the math. She lost 2 children before she died, 18 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. 24 of her immediate or descendants she lost before she passed away. So I can't imagine, I can't imagine the lives, the losses. Samuel Eberhard Kopp, he was born in near Württemberg, near Stuttgart in 1700, and was brought up in Lutheran faith. He married a widow, Anna Catherine Harlacher. That's why she has the Harlacher before the Kopp. And they came to America in 1738, first settling in Skippack. He was a potter by trade. He and his wife were part of a small group. We already talked about that. He died in Salisbury. So at the time he died, which was 1757, at the age of 57, Emmaus was still not named. It was named Salisbury at that point. Okay? And then Anna Catherine, his wife, was born in Lower Alsace and reared in as a Lutheran. She married her first husband, Conrad Harlacher, who died in 1722, and then in 1725, she married Samuel Kopp, and they had 3 children. She died 1 year before her husband. Neither lived to see the village laid out. When they died, the village name was Salisbury. Last one, Maria Barbara Andres Ehrenhardt was born near Mannheim in March of 1722, reared in the Reformed faith. She came to Pennsylvania with her father in the fall of 1731, so she was only 9 years old when she came. He settled west of Emmaus. After her marriage to Jacob Ehrenhardt in 1740, she frequently traveled to Bethlehem with him to attend the services. She had 10 children, 8 of which survived to adulthood, and 1 of which was born after her husband died. When she died, her 8 children became wards of the congregation. I should say, when he died, her 8 children became wards of the congregation. She didn't get remarried, so how was she going to support 8 children? So they became wards of the Emmaus Moravian Church congregation. That was how they were supported. And she was survived by her 8 children and 26 grandchildren. Okay. All right, now we have one more who went to Bethlehem to join, and then the 3 others were part of the charter members in Emmaus. So John Philip Kratzer, and you can see his grave was pretty nicely, is still pretty nicely preserved. You can see it's written in German, but you can read it pretty easily, not sandstone. The next grave is very difficult to read, and there are a few of these at God's Acre that the engraving, you can see sort of in parts of it, but other parts it looks like it's sort of washed away. And then the other 2 are examples of sandstone, which, very difficult, impossible to read. But I will tell you what some of them say. John Philip Kratzer, he learned a carpenter's trade from his father. And he came here, he married, he was born in Württemberg, Germany, Lutheran parents, and he married Maria Barbara Wendler in 1731, and they came with her to Pennsylvania in 1737. So his parents did not come, but he came with his wife. They were neighbors of Jacob Ehrenhardt and Sebastian Knaus, and their farm adjoined theirs. He died at age 79 in April of 1788. His wife was born in Württemberg, Germany as well, in 1700. She married him in 1737, as I said, and she came to know the Moravians as was one of the charter members of the Salisbury Church. Susan Graff was the wife of Joseph Graff. She died in 1757, and it's noted that she was buried at her own place as she was not a communicant. However, she has a gravestone at God's Acre. So this is one of the mysteries as to whether or not what her final resting place is. So it was noted in the diaries that she was buried at her place, but she has a stone at God's Acre. So you never assume, but I would probably say that she is buried at God's Acre. And then Johannes Knaus was the older brother of Sebastian Knaus. He was born in Tittelsheim, just like Sebastian, and he came to Pennsylvania with his parents and his brother. And in December of 1737, he married Maria Catherine Rader, and they settled in Mukundashire. He was a member of the Moravian congregation organized in 1747. He was a weaver by trade and a small farmer, and he died in June of 1761 at the age of 49. Okay, the last 4 of the founding members. We have Maria Catherine Rader Knaus Weiser. You think she got remarried? Possibly. We have John Friedrich Rauschenberger, Maria Barbara Getschy Rauschenberger, and Rosina Marzels Moser. So, Maria Catherine Rader Knaus Weiser was born in near Mannheim in 1720. She came to Pennsylvania at the age of 4 in 1724, and in 1728 she was living here with her parents. She married Johannes Knaus, the older brother Sebastian, in 1737, and they had 4 sons, of whom only one survived his childhood. So she lost 3 of them. Johannes died at the age of 49, so she married Christoph Weiser in 1762. So he died in 1761, and by 1762, a year later, she had remarried. It was second marriage after the deaths of both of their spouses. So Christoph Weiser was also his second marriage. He ended up dying in 1768. She survived her second husband by 18 years, and for the last 35 years of her life, she served Emmaus as the official midwife of the community. And she died in February of 1786. All right, Friedrich Rauschenberger was reared a Lutheran. He was born in 1715 and came to Pennsylvania in 1732. He married Maria Barbara Getschy in 1736. He was a miller by trade, and he was part of the 34 charter members. He died after a week-long illness in September of 1784 at the age of 70. The Reverend Anton Wagner, who was the first minister of Emmaus, of the congregation in 1747, actually conducted the burial, and there was a very large gathering for him. Maria Barbara Rauschenberger was born in Switzerland in 1715. She was the daughter of a Reformed clergyman. Her father had been sent by the Church of Holland to minister to the Reformed German settlers in Pennsylvania. Maria traveled to Pennsylvania with her parents and 7 siblings. So imagine being on a ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean, well, I believe it was the 1730s, with 8 kids. Imagine. You think traveling now with 8 kids would be difficult. So her father, when they got here, became ill, and as soon as he got ashore, he died. So Maria's brother followed in the father's footsteps. He was 17 years old, and he became a minister, ministering just like their father had. Maria had 4 sons and 6 daughters, so she had 10 children with Friedrich, and she died in October of 1780. Rosina Klein Mose was born in Alsace in 1703, and she married George Mose in November of 1728, and with him came to Pennsylvania in 1729 from Germany. Her husband received a land warrant in 1734. He died early. The year is unknown, but sometime after 1745, leaving her with 11 children. 2 of her children, George and Elizabeth, are the first 2 graves, and we looked at them. Rosina was also one of the charter members. She died in February of 1760 at the age of 57. But imagine being left with 11 children, and she did not remarry. Okay, now we have the graves of the first pastor and of Conrad Weiser. So you'll notice the first pastor's grave is written in English. It is also kind of a tiger marble, and it also has that little different kind of shape to it, which would have made the stone a little bit more expensive. And then Christoph Weiser's is one of those that has sort of a slatish top to it, but you can still see the engraving, and it's in German. So Anton Wagner, I guess he pronounced it, was born in Switzerland in 1709. He married Elizabeth Theory, and they came to Bethlehem in 1743 with 118 others. He served as minister in Heidelberg, Mühlbach, and Emmaus, and he died in 1796. Christoph Weiser was the brother of the famous colonial Indian agent named Conrad Weiser. Maybe that name rings a bell. He was also the uncle of Heinrich Melchior Muhlenberg's wife, and therefore the great uncle of General Peter Muhlenberg of Revolutionary War fame. He was born in 1699 in Württemberg. He was reared a Lutheran, and in 1709, Christoph and his 7 siblings, okay, once again, 8 children, were brought to New York province by their father, who traveled with a group of Palatines. So Christoph was indentured. Everybody understand what indentured means? So basically, he was a servant to help the family pay for their passage. So they had some of their children indentured, not only, the parents, but also the children. They eventually traveled to Pennsylvania, where they learned of the Moravians, and they joined the Heidelberg congregation in 1746. His wife Elizabeth died in 1760, and in 1762, he married Maria Catherine Rader, who was the widow of Johann Knaus, the brother of Sebastian. A lot of intermingling in the community. He was the second husband of Maria, who was the village midwife. He died in 1768 after a 24-hour illness, and he was buried on June 18th and had a very large funeral. You may wonder how I have gotten a lot of this information, and one thing I didn't mention was the Moravians were really good at keeping diaries. So a lot of this information was written down on a daily basis, and when there was a funeral, some of the burial registers even have like all the names of all the children. So not all of them have that, but a lot of them do. Or they outline, how many children, or those sorts of things. So I never realized that Jacob Ehrenhardt died before his wife had their last child. That was a revelation to me. I never even thought about, something like that happening. But anyway, okay. Now we have the Moravians and the Revolutionary War. Like the Quakers, most of the religious groups that settled in Pennsylvania, the Moravians were non-resistants. And what that means is they were pacifists. They were opposed to bearing arms, and they were opposed to the swearing of oaths of loyalty. I previously mentioned why the Moravians came to Bethlehem from Savannah, Georgia, fearful of being forced to bear arms in the English-Spanish conflict. The Moravians were a closed community at that point, and they continued to rely on their immunity from military service granted to them in 1749 by Parliament. So what happens with the Revolution? Unfortunately, with the Revolution, that immunity that they had an immunity. They didn't have to bear arms, which was under British rule. That immunity was not upheld during the Revolution. The Moravians did agree to do their part in caring for the sick and wounded. So each of these houses, which are still standing today on Main Street, served in 1777 to 1778 as makeshift hospitals for wounded soldiers. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Jacob Ehrenhardt House. It sits right on the corner of Keystone and Main, right across the street from the church. The Michael Knaus House may not be as familiar. It's actually on the other side of Main Street, about half a block up from Keystone. It was originally a colonial house that was made into 2 houses by one of the owners. That person had 2 daughters who were not married, and he wanted to provide houses for both of them before he passed away. So he divided his house into 2 houses, and then he continued to live in a building that he had in the backyard. So he lived on the property and gave his house, after he divided it in 2, to each one of his daughters. What happened in January of 1777, there were 40 wounded soldiers being treated at the Emmaus Hospital. Fast forward to October 8th, 1777, a military doctor arrived from Allentown with orders to bring additional sick soldiers to Emmaus. The people of Emmaus were not given a choice to care for the sick, but did so willingly. He requested the use of the Gemeinhaus. The Gemeinhaus was their church, it was their meeting place, and they decided they did not want the Gemeinhaus used for a hospital. So instead, they showed him two houses in Emmaus, one being that of the late Sister Ehrenhardt's house, so this was after she had passed away, and Michael Knaus's house, and they determined that they could use them. So 2 days later, they brought 70 sick and wounded soldiers. They already had 40 here, they brought another 70. And then on October 18th, more sick and wounded soldiers were brought from Allentown, and there were now 132 men being cared for in the village and in a neighbor's house, someone living maybe just outside of the village. Now, the population of the village at this time was 112 people, 49 of which were children, and there were 63 adults, 36 men and 27 women. So imagine, you have 132 men that you're caring for. That's a lot. Okay, next. The Moravians also assisted by opening their homes and village to soldiers traveling through. On March 3rd, 1777, there were 250 soldiers quartered in the village for the night. Now, you have 112 people and 49 of them are children. You have 250 soldiers that are sleeping either outside your house or in your house. And then on April 24th, there was a full regiment in Emmaus. 500 soldiers staying for the night with every house packed. Can't imagine. The acts of mercy and hospitality performed by the Moravians of Emmaus won the gratitude of the wounded soldiers and the house soldiers, and the respect of the military officers. However, the Moravians were not always treated with respect by all of their visitors. So there were many times that there were troops coming through, and the expectation of the troops, of the officers of the troops, was, we're here, you're going to take care of us. They did house the soldiers, but sometimes even the soldiers were even stealing from them. So it was not, they did it willingly, but it was not the best situation sometimes. Okay, we get to the story of the Revolutionary War veterans. Now, from the 1740s to 1770s, over 30 years, the Moravians lived in peace. And when the Revolutionary War began, that freedom of being a pacifist was once again changed. So during the years 1778 and 1779, the people of Pennsylvania were required to take an oath in order to achieve solidarity. The Moravians, of course, were against taking oaths of allegiance as pacifists and refused to participate in the fighting. So, on April 4, 1778, 12 men from Emmaus who refused to take an oath were imprisoned in Easton. They spent 4 weeks in prison before they were released. In May of 1778, the Moravians and the Schwenkfelders, another Protestant group, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Schwenkfelders, presented a petition to the State Assembly begging release from the militia, but the petitions were denied, although kind words were written about them and their support of the soldiers. So basically they said, sorry, you have to take this oath and you have to fight. In September of 1778, 10 more, including the pastor, Francis Baylor, were imprisoned in Easton for refusing to take the oath. After a lot of suffering, the 9 men that were imprisoned at that point took the oath and were released, but the pastor remained. He was later released September 30th. During the years 1777 to 1782, a total of 12 Moravians from Emmaus enlisted for the service in the Continental Army. It's believed they were influenced by their treatment and imprisonment, as well as the persecution of others in the village. So for a village of 112 inhabitants and one-third of the men serving in the militia, it really was a great hardship for the families left behind. Being pacifists, the Moravians did not celebrate the courageous service of these men. All 12 men did return home and continue to live peacefully in their community until their deaths. These men were unrecorded and forgotten for 150 years. Until 1930, when the members of the Liberty Bell chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution found them among the lists of those served in the war from Lehigh County. That's when they were finally recognized, and that's when additional recognition of their service started to show up on the cemetery. Okay, now we have the story of John Wetzel and how he was involved in the arrest and imprisonment of the men from the village of Emmaus. So let's explain to you who John Wetzel was. He was the second son of Conrad and Anna Katharina Bear Wetzel. Now remember, Conrad and Catherine Wetzel are my 6 times great-grandparents. So he's my 6 times great-granduncle. He was a member of the Moravian congregation of Emmaus. He was baptized by Bishop Spangenberg in Bethlehem. And then he became a prominent local figure in the Revolutionary War period. In 1776, he was elected to the First Assembly in November, and in 1777, he was appointed Lieutenant of Northampton County. So he was living in Bethlehem. He caused extreme hardship to the Moravians and other non-resistant sects like the Schwenkfelders. And he was responsible for the arrests of the 12 Moravians in Emmaus in April 1778. So he decided he was not going to have any arrests. He was not going to make any arrests in Bethlehem or Nazareth, 2 other Moravian communities. He chose Emmaus because he felt that would be easier and less likely to have any kind of interference with the arrests. So then he took these 12 men and he marched them like criminals down the streets of Bethlehem. And then they were imprisoned in Easton for a month. And they were set free after that month. But one was left in prison due to a private conflict with John Wetzel. According to the diaries, it was Brother Gearing. Gearing was later charged with being unfriendly toward independence. So, and then of course, once again, September 1778, as we said before, another 10 were imprisoned in Easton, including the pastor. November 1778, there was a bill to amend the oath law introduced. And December of 1778, the bill became law, and the test of loyalty was removed. So that was a very big relief for the Moravians. No more arrests for not agreeing to take the oath. Okay. This is, someone had asked, or actually someone had mentioned at another time when we were talking about God's Acre and the Moravians and how they served in the Revolutionary War, and someone said, well, they were pacifists, so I'm sure, they were just doing something like being a cook. They weren't doing anything like they weren't carrying arms or doing anything like that. Well, the Moravians that went to war, the 12 that went, served in the militia. They definitely carried arms. They were not conscientious objectors, as one person thought they may be. So the Pennsylvania militia was organized in 1777 under an act, and it provided for compulsory enrollment by the constables of all able-bodied male whites between the ages of 18 and 53. Imagine being 53 and enlisting to go to war. Exemptions were very limited, and an estimated 60,000 men were enrolled. So that's what was going on in Pennsylvania. So here are the Revolutionary War veterans, and And I color-coded this because I thought it would be easier to see when the people, what battalions, who was together, who wasn't, the different years. So the first two, Andreas Goering and Martin Liebert, it appears they might have been together. They both went in 1777. They were in the 7th Company, the 1st Battalion of Northampton County. Ludwig Andreas, he went in 1781, so that was quite a bit later than the first two. And he served in a different company from everybody else. Karl Ludwig Kunkler, and we'll talk about him a little later, he also went a little bit later in 1780 and served in the 5th Company. He actually served twice. You can see in 1780 and then in 1781. Joseph Kluhl was also a two-time service. He served in 1780 as well as 1782. Michael Bauer and George Christ, looks like they may have served together in the same company in 1782. And then the last 5 could possibly have all been together. Jacob Ehrenhardt Jr., Heinrich Knaus, George Liebert, Jacob Wench, and Abraham Ziegler all served in the 7th Company in 1782. So those were the assignments. Okay, so I wanted to put this up to show you what everybody did for a living and how old they were when they went in. So we have Ludwig Andreas, he was 47. He was a farmer. Michael Bauer was also a farmer, 36. George Christ was also a farmer at age 29. Then you have Joseph Kluhl, who was a weaver and a farmer. Jacob Ehrenhardt Jr. was actually a shoemaker. Andreas Goering was a shoemaker. He was 47. And Jacob Ehrenhardt Jr. was 21. So quite a big age difference there. Joseph Kluhl was 19. Heinrich Knaus was 40. He was the wainwright, the wagon maker. Then we have Karl Ludwig Kunkler. He was age 23. He was actually the church organist, the church bookkeeper, and a nailsmith. George Liebert was a blacksmith and a farmer, age 46. Martin Liebert was a turner. That was somebody that worked with a lathe to make furniture. He was age 37. Jacob Wench was a pipe and tinsmith, age 33, and then we have Abraham Ziegler, who was a weaver and age 25. So those are the backgrounds of the 12 men that went. Doesn't sound like they were prepared as warriors based on what they did for a living. Okay, so I thought this was very interesting too, and I learned a lot from doing this little slide. Ludwig Andreas, it was a small community, so we have to see how everybody was related. Ludwig Andreas was the brother-in-law of Sebastian Knaus. Michael Bauer was one of only 2 of the 12 that was not related to anybody. But then we have George Christ, who was the son-in-law of Ludwig Andreas. And Joseph Kluhl was the son-in-law of Sebastian Knaus and Martin Liebert because he married twice. He lost one wife and then gained another. We have Jacob Ehrenhardt, who was Jr., who was the son of Jacob Ehrenhardt and the brother-in-law to the Liebert brothers, which means that the Liebert brothers married sisters of Jacob Ehrenhardt Jr. There's going to be a test afterwards on this. Okay, then we have Andreas Goering, who was the brother-in-law of Sebastian Knaus. We have Heinrich Knaus, who was the son of Sebastian Knaus and the son-in-law of Jacob Ehrenhardt. And then we have Karl Kunkler. He was just the organist and bookkeeper, but he knew everybody in the community. George Liebert was the brother to Martin and the son-in-law of Jacob Ehrenhardt. And then Martin Liebert was the brother to George, so those were 2 brothers, and they married sisters. Okay? Son-in-law of Jacob Ehrenhardt. Then we have Jacob Wench, who was the son-in-law of Andreas Goering, and we have Abraham Ziegler, who was also the son-in-law of Andreas Goering. We have 3 son-in-laws of Andreas Goering in this group. Yeah. And 1, 2, 3 son-in-laws of Jacob Ehrenhard too. Yeah, so it was a very small community, and everybody was related to everybody else. Okay, 2 of the enlistees were sons of the fathers of Emmaus. Heinrich Knaus was the son of Sebastian Knaus, and Jacob Ehrenhard Jr. was the son of Jacob Ehrenhard. They were the builders of the Knaus homestead in 1777. That was Heinrich Knaus. And the 1803 house was built by Jacob Ehrenhard Jr. And here are their graves. You can see they're fairly easily readable. The Heinrich Knaus's grave is done in English, as is Jacob Ehrenhard Jr.'s. Heinrich Knaus was born in Salisbury in 1741. He was the son of Sebastian Knaus and firstborn of 14 children, and he was the wagon builder. He married Anna Maria Ehrenhard, daughter of Jacob Ehrenhard. They were married for 44 years, had 6 sons and 7 daughters. He was survived by 30 grandchildren, and he died at age 68. Jacob Ehrenhard Jr. was born in 1760, the son of Jacob Ehrenhard and Maria Barbara Andres. He was born 7 months after his father had died and was the last of 8 children. In his youth, he learned the shoemaker trade in Emmaus. For a number of years, he lived in Whitehall, where he married Susanna Sager, and they moved to Emmaus to become members of the congregation again. She died in 1819. They were married for 34 years, had 4 daughters. And in 1822, he married a second time, and he died in 1825 at the age of 65. The oldest enlistee, or I should say one of the oldest, he was 47, is Andreas Gearing. He was of Lutheran parentage. He learned the shoemaker's trade and came to Pennsylvania in 1751. He married the sister of Sebastian Knaus. They were married for 49 years. That's quite an accomplishment back then. Most people didn't live quite that long. They had 13 children, including 2 sets of twins. 9 of the 13 children lived to adulthood, so they lost 4 children. He was a farmer in the community and one of the first to enlist and the oldest to enlist at age 47. He had 42 grandchildren and 10 great-grandchildren, of which 25 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren survived at his death. He died in March of 1803 at the age of 73. So, once again, the math, he lost 4 children, 17 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild before he died. Okay, George Liebert, he was born in Philadelphia. He was baptized Catholic. He came to Emmaus and learned the blacksmith trade from Jacob Ehrenhard, and he married Elizabeth Ehrenhard, the daughter of Jacob Ehrenhard. So he learned his trade and then married his teacher's daughter. He took over the trade and the farm of his father-in-law and joined the Emmaus congregation. So there was somebody to take over the farm after Jacob Ehrenhard died. He became a widower when his wife died in 1801. They had 12 children. He was survived by 8 of them. He also had 15 grandchildren, of whom 3 died prior to his death. So he lost 4 children and 3 grandchildren. And then we have Karl Ludwig Kunkler, who was born in Bethlehem, shoemaker. He was the son of a shoemaker, and he moved to Emmaus, where he was the church bookkeeper and organist. He enlisted at the age of 23. He later married Barbara Lanius. They had 3 children, and he died at the young age of 39. So, we're talking about a lot of deaths, so I figured I would just pull up some of the reasons behind those deaths that are listed on the Register of Burials. So early on, they did not list the cause of death. But as time went on, there were quite a few listed in the Register of Burials and the Funeral Register as far as the cause of death. So you see a lot of the diseases that you think, oh, that's not really fatal. But actually back then, it was. So you have measles, smallpox, which we don't even talk about anymore, convulsions, nervous fever, which was another term for typhoid fever. I looked that one up. Choking rheum, and that was some sort of mucus buildup in your throat where you would choke from it. Something you don't hear of anymore. Typhoid fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, consumption, which was now tuberculosis, what we call tuberculosis. Quinsy, which was that throat abscess. Croup, scarlet fever, dropsy. Dropsy was swelling related to heart failure. It's now called edema. Okay? Dysentery, you don't hear people dying of dysentery anymore. Not here, at least. Gangrene, pneumonia. Apoplexy was the incapacity due to stroke or cerebral hemorrhage. So basically, you have a stroke or you have a cerebral hemorrhage. Stillbirth was, there were children that were born. And then childbirth was another cause. And then, of course, you had accidents. So these were all common diseases and causes of death of the early settlers. There are 120 children out of the 366 burials of God's Acre. So about a third of the burials at God's Acre are children. The village of Emmaus did not have a doctor for over 51 years from the time of the first burial and used healing methods learned from the Lenape. There were no vaccines, no doctors, no hospitals for the ill, except for the hospitals that were used during the Revolutionary War for the soldiers. There was no isolation, not enough knowledge of treatment for some of the diseases, not a lot of knowledge of disinfection or cleanliness. And here's something, one of the things I learned last night, this one thing I knew. In July of 1858, this is once again my spreadsheet talking, 7 residents of Emmaus died from dysentery. So I'm thinking, oh, they're adults. Well, it turns out that dysentery that went through households, the 7 that died were all children. There were, it was interesting. I saw some people who died of measles and whooping cough. They had it each at the same time. So there was a lot of things that were going through the community. Okay, so here's the first town doctor. He arrives in 1794, Dr. Dixon. Okay, he studied medicine in Washoe, North Carolina. He was born in 1762, and he came to Emmaus in 1794. Not sure how he got from North Carolina to Emmaus, but why he chose Emmaus. But he met Rosina Huber in Emmaus once he got to Emmaus, and they had 4 children. 2 daughters and a son survived him. 1 child was lost. He died in July of 1804, just 10 years after he arrived, at the age of 42, of tuberculosis. So it was going through the community quite a bit, and as a doctor, he was being exposed to all kinds of things. So, but he was the first doctor in the village. And this is his stone. You can see it's tiger marble. It's pretty clear. That's the only doctor that's buried at God's Acre. Okay, so we're going to look at some pictures of the 2022-2023 restoration. The before and after discoveries. We have 236, grave 236 was Cordelia Christ. You can see the grave on the left is before it was cleaned, and the grave on the right, and we're talking about the 2 graves to the left. The grave on the right, you can see Cordelia Christ on that grave, and that's after being cleaned. Okay. The next two pictures show where the red flag is. I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of a stone right beside the red flag. There's also a tree root beside the red flag. But you might not even realize that next to the red flag is a little bit of a stone. So if you look at the right, that white stone is what that little tiny speck of a stone on the left was. So that stone was completely underground. Cordelia Christ was the daughter of James Christ, and she died at the age of 10. These are two little girls. And Anna Elizabeth Spanheimer, which is the, could you go back to that's the white stone on the right, all the way to the right, was one of the 7 children who died of dysentery in July of 1858. Okay. So here's the discovery of one of the missing stones. There were 7 originally, we found 1. The location of these stones were marked with red flags. So I put red flags where the stone was supposed to be in the row, as per the 1939 inventory. And then the attempt was to locate them was done by ground penetration. And this was one stone that was rediscovered. It was buried 1 foot down. So when I say, well, maybe we will find some of the other 6, it's a possibility, depending on, how far down they are. But right now, we found 1. And this was Catherine Christ. She was the daughter of George and Catherine Christ, and she died at 9 months. The stone is quite worn from being buried. Okay, next. There are a few African Americans buried at God's Acre. Here are 2. One is Henry Gilchrist, and the other is John Gilchrist. So originally I thought they might have been related, but they actually, I'm not sure if they are. Henry Gilchrist was born in Amwell Township, Hunterdon County, New Jersey in 1796. So he was free. He was born free. He came to Emmaus from Kutztown, where he had lived for some time, and he was the son of John and Catherine Gilchrist. He died of intermittent fever, or typhoid fever, at the age of 28. John Gilchrist was the son of Cornelius Gilchrist, a weaver, and Elizabeth. They were both African American. They lived 2.5 miles from Emmaus. He died in 1834 at age 22. It's unknown whether these 2 were related. It's a possibility, though. The Jesse Diesch story. So we were pulling up these graves to clean them and to recondition them and put them back above ground. And this was the 2 on the left is the before and after of the stone being cleaned. The infant daughter of Jesse and Anna Diesch, born and died May 21st, 1861. Well, when we pulled up this grave, on the other side, it was just the grave of Jesse W. Diesch. So I'm standing there thinking, when I'm talking to the person who's working with me, I'm like, oh, I wonder if they buried them together. I wonder if they put him in as well. And then I started thinking, well, that doesn't quite make sense. So you would think. So anyway, I researched Jesse Diesch, found him on the Lutheran and Reformed Cemetery, and the stone on the right is not God's Acre. Okay, they're not flat stones, and it is the gravestone of Jesse Diesch and his wife. Apparently, after Jesse Diesch died, his wife decided, and there were 27 years between his death and her death, his wife or the family decided on having a dual gravestone for them. And so what they did was, I'm not sure if the infant daughter originally had a stone, so they used Jesse Diesch's original stone for the infant daughter still. Interesting. Okay, the David Seam story and his murderer. All right, yes, there is a murderer buried at God's Acre. So here's the story. David Seam was mortally wounded by a pistol shot on April 2nd, 1864, and he died instantly. He was married and the father of 4 children. The story is that he was in a bar having a few drinks when an argument ensued with William Kisk, sometimes written Keck in the Barber book. So William Kisk was arrested for murder, and he was the very first person to be hanged in Lehigh County. Now, in the book They Came to Emmaus, it's noted that the Kisk grave, number 311A, is adjacent to the Seam grave, number 311. So if you go to God's Acre, you will see the Seam grave, and then there's a big empty space of grass next to the Seam grave. So one story in a ghost book that was written about 10 years ago is that the people of Emmaus were so upset that a murderer was buried right next to the man he murdered, that they demanded that this murderer be dug up and removed and put on the other Moravian cemetery. Well, that's an old wives' tale. That never happened. Okay? But it is in a book. So if you ever do a ghost tour and you hear that story, it's not true. Okay. So William Kisk was indeed buried in the same row as David Seam, but definitely quite a few graves away from David Seam. And it's noted in the Moravian Register of Deaths that the grave was marked with an uncut fieldstone. So during the 2022-2023 God's Acre restoration, the fieldstone was raised. We found it, and it's visible today. So that is William Kisk's gravestone. Now we have Civil War veteran John Everett. He's one of 2 Union soldiers buried there. He moved to Illinois from Emmaus to live with his uncle after his father died, and he later returned to Emmaus. He served in the Union Army during Civil War for almost 4 years. He ended up dying of his injuries in a hospital in Germantown at the age of 25. All right, so here's a map of Emmaus, where God's Acre is the big square in the center, and the lines across, that's Minor Street. And this was a map that was made when they decided to extend Minor Street. Minor Street ended at God's Acre, but they wanted to extend it. So you'll see a little tiny triangle in the middle, and you'll see 4 different little rectangles there. Those are graves that they noted on this map. Grave number 1, which is the one that's in the triangle, is the unknown colored soldier, 1877. Okay, that's historic language, so I don't want to offend anybody. Grave 2, 3, and 4 are the other 3 little rectangles that are on the map. So this is pretty much a map that they were working with to get the extension of Minor Street. At one point, it was thought they were going to have to move those 4 graves, but it turned out that they didn't have to move 3 of them. So the 3 that are located closer to where the cemetery is, they were not moved. And these are the graves. So Harmon Wilcox was 2 months and 23, a year, 2 months and 23 days old. He's buried in a boys' row and was a child. And Irvin Oswell was also buried in that same row as a child. They are both at the end of row 12. The other one, Townsend, is buried in a man's row in row 10. and his grave was not relocated. But they did relocate the unknown colored Union Civil War veteran. His name is actually Theodore Clymer. So I just want to read to you what was known in 1877 when he died. He died on a passenger train that had passed through Emmaus on its way to Bethlehem. His identity was known as determined by the funeral record of the Rangan pastor. And here is all the information that was noted in his funeral record. Theodore Clymer, colored, son of William and Julia Nee Harris Clymer, the mother of a slave. She was born in Delaware in 1826. He was born in Chester County in 1844, died on a passenger train of Crampits near Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, January 29, 1877. He was baptized in an ME Congregation Church in Reading, Pennsylvania. He reached the age of 32 years, 7 months, 14 days. He is buried near the south or southeast corner of Old Moravian Cemetery in this town, where I made an English address to mourners. The large concourse of people brought here by curiosity. He served during the late Civil War in Company B, 24th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops Volunteers from January 7, 1865 to October 1, 1865 as a private. He was discharged in Richmond, Virginia from the service of the United States. So this is where the mystery begins. How is it we knew so much about this person who was buried there, and at some time between 1877 and 1939, he became the unknown colored Union Civil War veteran? We don't know. We haven't solved that mystery yet. It was documented in 1939 that there was a stone in row 12, the unknown colored Union Civil War veteran. So sometime between 1877 and 1939, someone put a marker on that grave that said that. And then according to the church records, that gravestone was also replaced in 1964 and 1965 with another stone, which is the current stone. So just to try to shorten the story a little bit, they're moving the grave. They go to, they take the stone up, and there's a picture of the stone sitting against a tree and the flag, and there they are moving the grave. And it turns out they couldn't find the remains under the stone. Okay, so what they did, and this is 1970, so it's not that long ago, what they did was they dug up some of the earth, and this was what they legally had to do because they were moving the remains. They dug up some earth from under the stone. They moved the earth to the new burial site in row 8, and then they put the stone on top of it. Okay. Next, they find the remains. Okay, so this is what happened. They're digging the street up because, you know, they're going to move Minor Street. So they're digging, and all of a sudden, in June of 1971, they come across the remains. So everything stopped. All the digging stopped. They called the borough. They called the church. And these people were present when the remains were dug up. Okay? The remains had a Civil War uniform hat on. There were a few bones, and it also seemed that there was the remains of a wooden coffin. So all of that was removed. However, I asked Linda Miller isn't here tonight. No, okay. I asked Linda Miller if she could come tonight. I'm talking about this at church one day, and she's telling me, oh, I remember that. Her father, Walter Schwartz, was part of the cemetery committee. And when they dug up these remains, they had to put them somewhere before they could rebury them because they had to have a funeral. So for a few days, the remains went to Walter Schwartz's garage. And that's where she saw them, and They apparently took pictures of them, which she has, but she can't find them right now. So that's the story. So the remains were then reburied underneath the current stone. It's still unknown why they lost track of who he was and then became unknown. But eventually, there's one other question. There is a U.S. military stone at the unknown colored, and it lists the death date, not of 1877, but 1878. So apparently the U.S. Maybe got late notice of his death. I'm not quite sure, but there's a different death date on the military stone. Last burial is Alan Sims. He was the very last one buried, 1897. Not much is known about him, except that don't know where he was born. He had a large funeral when he was buried. So I looked him up a little bit, found him in the census records of 1860. He was living in Salisbury, working as a farm laborer and living with the Klein family. So he was a free African American. And in 1880, he was noted as a boarder living with the Shell family. But he had a large funeral. The pastor states he was buried at 1:30 in the afternoon, and a lot of people came to see him. So maybe he had a lot of family or friends around. All right, just the last slide. I just want to thank a few people or things, or I used a reference. They came to Emmaus for a lot of the historical information on the Revolutionary War. The Moravian Archives just kept digging for me, literally, on Theodore Clymer and his whole situation. So I got a lot of information from the Moravian Archives on Theodore Clymer and some of the other things. And then the Moravian Church, of course, register of burials, and a lot of information from them on the 1939 inventory. So, all right. Sorry I took so long, and thank you for remaining with me. So.